Good afternoon. We're going to get started. My name is Deborah Gonzalez, and I'm the Director of Government Affairs here at PPIC, the Public Policy Institute of California. And thank you for joining us today. For those of you who are not familiar with PPIC, we're a nonpartisan, nonprofit think tank with offices in both Sacramento and San Francisco. PPIC has just released a new PPIC report titled Implementing the Next Generation Science Standards, Early Evidence from California. We'd like to thank the S.D. Bechtel Jr. Foundation for their support of this work. You should have received a copy of the report on your chair. There are additional copies in the back of the room. The full report, along with the slide from today's presentations, are now both available online at ppic.org. Lead author, Nu Gao, will be presenting the main findings from the report. I'd like to also acknowledge her co-authors, Sarah Aden, who is also here today, Luna Lopez, and Grace Lee. Following Nu's presentation, PPIC Director of Research, Science Fellow, Patrick Murphy will moderate a great panel of experts on the topic. You should also have received an agenda when you came in, and all the speakers' bios are on the back side of that agenda. So in the interest of time, we'll only have short introductions of our panelists. If there are any clarifying questions about the report, we'll have time we'll have some time later on, and you can ask those questions. Please note that we also have an online audience today, so when you ask a question, please wait for a microphone so that the online audience can hear you. A couple more things before we begin today. You'll receive a short survey. We love our surveys here at PPIC, and we ask you to take some time and respond to those surveys. And finally, please silence your cell phones. Today's discussion is about how the state is implementing the state's science standards adopted in 2013. And I'm excited that we have a wonderful panel here to discuss how to ensure science standards are adopted by more schools, particularly those serving disadvantaged communities. But let's step back for a more fundamental question. Why is science education and science important to California? At the simple level, studying science allows students to develop skills of planning and conducting investigations, gathering information, teamwork, and evaluating their findings. The nature of science is to make observations of the natural world, to try and identify patterns, ask questions, and find answers. Dare I say, it's the most fact-based of many programs. Beyond the skills of science education gives students, there are also significant social benefits we need to acknowledge. Recent scientific breakthroughs speak for themselves. The advancement in medicine, particularly in genome, is a classic example. A shout out to my daughter who is studying and works in this field. There are also economic advantages of STEM. And I don't just mean that my daughter's getting a free advanced education, but that's actually been a good one for me personally. But I didn't know about that when we actually were considering some of her degree options. But as an economist has stated, a country's proficiency in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics is vital to generating economic growth and advancing scientific innovation and creating good jobs. So today's discussion isn't simply about adopting science standards, but it's instead about something more important. It's an effort to ensure that California students have the opportunity to learn vital skills and participate in one of the fastest economic sectors that will provide and promote important benefits to the state and the nation as a whole. Yeah, no pressure, guys, but this is all about you. I'd like to introduce Nu Gao, and she is a research fellow at PPIC, specializing in K-12 education. Her areas of interest include math and science education, digital learning in K-12 schools, and teacher workforce. Thank you.
Thank you for coming to today's event. So I'm going to do a very quick summary of our report. All of the details, because of the time constraint, I wouldn't be able to go into all of the details, but all of them are included in our report. So California has made great strides in science education. However, there's still room for improvement. When we are looking at student performances on some national assessments, for instance, NAEP, so California actually is at the bottom. And it also has one of the largest achievement gaps along the lines of student race, ethnicity, and also family income. So there is this urgent need to improve science education in California. As part of the policy response, the State Board of Education adopted a new set of science standards in 2013. The new standards are called the Next Generation Science Standards. NGSS are different from the previous science standards in a few different ways. So the first, NGSS, these are internationally benchmarked against countries that typically do very well in those science assessment. For instance, countries that include Singapore, Finland, South Korea, Canada, and Japan. The second, the NGSS really wanted to make this standard accessible to all of the students in all subject areas, which means that the standards are not just for students who are in the gifted programs, or the standards are only for subject areas that will be tested in standardized testing. Under NGSS, there's a lot of connection between NGSS and Common Core Math and English standards, as well as the new English language development. So learning in one subject area could really enhance learning in other subject areas as well. So last and the core of NGSS is what we typically call three-dimensional learning. In our report, we had an example of what three-dimensional learning looks like. So I'm not going into further detail about three-dimensional learning. California has a specific timeline for NGSS in implementation in schools. And in this figure, what we showed some of the key events, not all of them, some of the key events during the implementation timeline. So we're in 2018. Let me try. We're in 2018, so this year a few things are going to happen. Next month, the new science assessment, the CAST, will be field tested in April. And later this year, the state has already begun its process to review the instructional materials, and the State Board of Education is going to take some action to adopt those instructional materials in the fall. So given this timeline, really it is time to look at where districts are in terms of the implementation process. And so this is the purpose of our report. And we're interested in looking at, where districts are in terms of the implementation process. Have they encountered any challenges or issues in the implementation process? And if they did, what can policymakers do to help improve the implementation process? In order to do so, we developed a survey in the spring of 2017. And so we sent out the survey. We sent out the survey to all of those unified and high school districts in the spring of 2017. And after some targeted outreach event, we were able to get close to half of them to respond. So this really gave us a very solid example to work with. And we also weighted those respondents. So our weighted sample is not very different from the statewide average. In terms of student, district, and neighborhood characteristics. So this, as I said, this really gave us a very good sample to work with. And some of the good news is, awareness level is very high. So based on our survey, the vast majority of those respondents, they're either familiar or very familiar with NGSS. And when we compare this to the previous science standards, what we found actually is the awareness level is higher with NGSS, which is a great thing. But there is some very interesting variation. For instance, 25% of those respondents in low performance districts, they're not familiar with NGSS. And this is a little bit concerning given the state's implementation timeline. And also based on our survey, the vast majority of districts, they said their districts were implementing the NGSS in their classrooms at the time of the survey, which was spring 2017. Again, and so this is good news. But again, there is some very interesting and very important variation. For instance, when we're looking at urban districts, almost all of them, for instance, 94% of the urban districts, they are implementing NGSS at the time of the survey. Under NGSS, because NGSS presented paradigm shift, so districts have a lot of choices when it comes to science course. And for middle schools, districts could choose between a discipline-specific model, which, for instance, biology, chemistry, or physics, or they can choose an integrated model, for instance, all science, every science, every year. And so the integrated model is the state's preferred model. And in this column, what we're showing here is, the overall response. And you can tell that, more than half of those districts, they have chosen the state's preferred model, which is the integrated model for their middle schools. And about a quarter of them, they have stuck with the traditional discipline-specific model. And interestingly, about 20% of the districts, they were not decided at the time of the survey. And again, given the state's implementation timeline, this is a little bit concerning. And when we're looking at the variation across districts, what we found is a really important urban-rural divide. So here what we're showing is the results for rural districts. What you can see is the vast majority, so 55% of them, they have chosen the traditional discipline-specific model. And very few of them actually have chosen the state's preferred model. And close to a third of them, they have not made a decision at the time of the survey. So, and when you're looking at urban districts, however, you see the vast majority of them have chosen the state's preferred model. So when I saw those figures, I think this has a lot of, implications for student learning. Because, one of the reasons that state chose the integrated model as the preferred model is because the Achieve.org, they did an international benchmark study, and what they found is, for instance, in countries where students typically do well in science, they tend to, students are learning science from an integrated model. So if, integrated model really is more effective, then, there are some implications, for instance, what about those students, in rural districts? Are they left behind just because their district have chosen a model that is not as effective as integrated model? So next for high school, again, under LCFF, every decision is local decision. And for high schools, districts, again, they have a couple of options to choose from. So 3-course model and 4-course model are pretty much similar, and they're all based on the traditional, biology, physics, and chemistry. And the only difference between the 3-course model and the 4-course model is how Earth and space science was structured. So for instance, for 3-course model, Earth and space science was integrated with biology, chemistry, and physics. But for a 4-course model, so Earth and space science was listed as the 4th model. And the districts could also, choose an fully integrated model. For instance, every science, every year. Or they can choose to develop their own model. So these are the results for high school. And if you look at the first column here, you can tell that close to half of those districts, they have chosen the 3-course model for their high schools. And again, about 20% of them were undecided at the time of the survey. And once again, we see some very important urban-rural divide. For instance, close to more than half of those districts in rural areas, they have chosen the 3-course model. And interestingly, when we're looking at urban districts, more districts in those urban areas, they tend to be undecided at the time of the survey. And in our report, we also asked districts whether or not they have encountered any challenge, and if so, what are those specific challenges? And what we found, are a couple of challenges. So the first is the selection of instructional materials. And we are not going to talk a lot about this just because, like I said, the state is, expected to take some actions later this fall, which we hope is going to solve a lot of the problems now. And the second one is science labs. And in our survey, most of the districts, they express concerns about science labs. So, for instance, most of them do not have, sufficient labs for science learning, or their labs are not modern enough. And most of the districts also do not seem to have, sufficient equipment for science learning. So the last one is, teacher preparation. And more than 75% of the respondents, they reported that, teachers are not prepared, are not well prepared to teach under NGSS. And related to teacher preparation is teacher shortage. As many of you know, California has, a chronic teacher shortage problem, and the problem is worse in science. And one of the implication is, average class sizes tend to be larger in science. What we're showing here is the average class size for different subject areas. And the the horizontal line is the national average for science. And so the left panel shows the results for middle school, and the right panel shows the results for high school. The green line shows the results for science. And you can tell two things. First, average class size tend to be larger in science compared to math or English. And the second, compared to national average, the average class size in California is significantly larger. In our report, we also identify some of the challenges that are not unique to NGSS, but they are very important if we want to ensure that the state and schools are successful in the implementation process. And here we summarize a few. So the first is the graduation requirements. And California actually is one of the few states that only require 2 years of science for high school graduation. And we know that NGS for a successful implementation of NGSS requires a minimum of 3 years and preferably 4 years. In our report, local districts, they have the authority to raise their own graduation requirements. And as you can tell from our report, most of them do not opt to do so. And the second challenge is science has not been a priority in most schools. And science has taken a backseat to math and English. And in our report, we provided some data showing that students receive much less instruction time in science compared to math or English, and particularly in early grades. We know that students learning in early grades is really, really important for their science learning in later years. So the lack of exposure to quality science education in early grades is a big concern. And most of the districts, they said, the lack of exposure to quality science in early grades is a big challenge in their districts. So to address some of the issues and to make sure that districts are successful in the implementation process, we offer a few policy recommendations. So first, the state needs to do some targeted outreach to raise awareness, particularly in those low performance districts. And the state could also provide more guidance about different science courses under NGSS. We hope that our report could be really helpful to local districts so they can learn from each other. But at the same time, because those course sequence have a lot of implications for student learning, and also for high schools, they have important implications on how and whether students can fulfill the UC-CSU eligibility. So we think a lot more guidance from the state will be very helpful. And we also think the state should raise its science graduation requirements just to align with NGSS. And like I said, NGSS, there's a lot of integration between NGSS and math and English standards. So this really provides us a very nice opportunity to leverage NGSS to really make science a priority in schools. And to do so, we could consider, the state should consider adding more science-specific indicators in the state's accountability system. So this concludes my presentation. Before I invite the panel up, is there any clarifying questions from the audience? Okay, great, thank you. So now please join me in welcoming the panelists.
Thank you all for coming and attending, and thank you all for tuning in online. My name is Patrick Murphy, and as Deborah said, I'm Research Director at the Public Policy Institute of California. We're really excited to both release this report as well as share with you what we hope will be, I think, an interesting discussion from our panelists. I'm going to assume that you're all capable of reading the longer bios on the backs of the agenda, but just for welcoming and identification purposes, we're real pleased to have Stacy Lerma here. She's the Science Professional Development Specialist from Moreno Valley Unified School District in Riverside County. Next to her, Jessica Sacco, who's the Executive Director of the California Science Teachers Association. And then on the end is Trish Williams, and Trish is on the State Board of Education, and among her portfolio, science is a big chunk of it. So as I say, we're pleased to have you. If you can't tell, we've been pretty conscientious in terms of trying to get different perspectives on the same topic. New has provided you all with the overview of the report and a sense of where things stand from one perspective. And I think what would be a real useful place for us to start is to ask our panelists if they could kind of give us a sense of where things stand from if you will, where they sit. And maybe it'll be easiest if I'll start on the end, Trish, and work from the state down to the local level, as it were. So.
Okay. First, I want to say thank you for inviting me here today. I'm pleased to talk about NGSS. Anyone that knows me in the science community knows that it's been a real passion for me. And it started as a passion for me from the moment I got onto the board in January 2011. I heard that summer about this new thing called Next Generation Science Standards, and they were having a 3-hour workshop in Washington, D.C. by Change the Equation, and Stephen Pruitt, who was the lead at Achieve, was running that workshop. So I asked President Kirst if I could attend, and I sat through 3 hours with no formal science background of my own, but with my younger son, a natural-born scientist, and sat through all 3 hours and thought, I get this. I get why this is important. I get what these changes mean and why this is going to be a better way to go. So I've been committed ever since. I'm going to give you a quick overview of the various policies, actions that we've taken and that are about to be taken for California. I'm not going to go in any detail on any of them because you can ask questions later if you have more specific interests. Also, let me just say I'm at the tail end of a 3-week bout of congestion, so forgive me for the raspiness in my throat. Okay, on standards. The Next Generation Science Standards were actually developed and led by Achieve, the national nonprofit organization, but developed with tons of feedback from 26 states. And California, of course, gave the most feedback of any other state. So by the time we finished reviewing those standards in that process, I didn't review them, but we had expert panels. We had a large, what I refer to as the group of 80 science educators from all over California, and then it got reduced down to 25 educators and faculty members, not just K-12, university, and also industry, that did the final look at them and made a decision about whether to recommend, made a few tweaks, made them fit California, made sure that they weren't just the national standards, they were our standards, and they recommended those to us. We approved them in July 2013. And then, in general, approved them. And then in September 2013, we approved for the middle grades the integrated model of NGSS as our preferred model for the reasons that you heard Niu talk about. They had done the research. It was the only one recommended to us, to the state board, by the science expert panel. The research is very strong around that being a better way for students to learn, and it especially fits the way NGSS is structured. So also in 2014, we then at the state level, the CDE developed and the state board adopted an implementation plan for NGSS. In 2014 and 16, we convened a NGSS curriculum framework committee. These are all kind of standard things that are done with any kind of standards, academic standards adoption at the state level. The curriculum framework committee had about, I want to say, 30, 35 people on it. It was co-chaired by Helen Quinn is the one I remember. And Robert Sheriff. And Helen Quinn is a professor of physics emeritus at Stanford, and she was actually the chair of the National Academies of Science framework for K-12 science and how it ought to be taught. So we had a really high-powered group doing our curriculum framework. It turned out to be a real challenge, that curriculum framework, because NGSS standards are more complicated in the way they are formatted, and they also represent huge pedagogical shifts. They move hands-on learning and inquiry and investigation and experimentation to the center. And so it took longer to do our curriculum framework than was originally anticipated. We had to ask for an extension from the legislature to do that. So it took almost 2 years. I attended every one of those meetings and listened and watched and learned. By the time they finished them, then it was time to schedule the instructional materials review. So the instructional materials review is not out of sync with the plan. It is, in fact, you can't schedule instructional materials review until you have a curriculum framework. The curriculum framework then tells all the curriculum providers and the publishers, this is what we want to see in our instructional materials in California. So you can't stop the curriculum framework development on one day and the next day start instructional materials review. The publishers, the curriculum providers have to have enough time to develop well-aligned materials. So that is on schedule for this year. They've already started the process for instructional materials review. We anticipate it will come to the state board. The recommendations will come to the state board of which publishers, which curriculum materials will come to us in November for consideration of adoption. So let me tell you a little bit about the Next Generation Science State Summative Test. The pilot was in 2017. It's our own test. There's no other state that has this test. We developed it ourselves based upon how we adopted California NGSS, and there were a tremendous number of really highly expert scientists, individuals. That's one of the things I love about California is how rich it is in intellectual capital here. And so we had faculty at Stanford that had developed some science performance items for some of the international tests and the national test, and they worked with ETS and with CDE to develop our own test in California. So that test was piloted in 2017. There's going to be a full census field test this spring, with the operational test anticipated for the spring of 2019. And I sort of fudge that a little bit because each year we do it and then we learn from it and make sure that we feel like it's valid and working well, working the way we intended, and then we move on to the next step. One of the things I'll tell you quickly about what makes this test different, besides what I just said, is that in the past, California had a test for science at 5th grade that covered only 5th grade material, and at 8th grade that covered only 8th grade material. This test has, the 5th grade test will cover all 3 dimensions of NGSS but for 5th grade, but it will cover the disciplinary core ideas that were in 3rd and 4th. So it'll be a 3-year span, and the same is true for 8th grade. It'll be 6th, 7th, and 8th, which, if you have your thinking caps on, you realize that you can't not teach science in the previous years and have your students do well on that test. One of the other great things about NGSS is that it tends to build on each year. They go back and review material, pull material in, build on ideas. And so that's another reason why we need to have the test cover more of a grade span. Accountability. So what are we doing with NGSS accountability? There's 2 things that we're doing. One is that we require district LCAPs, local control accountability plans, to address state priority number 2, which is the implementation of all adopted state standards. So every district or LEA should have a section in their LCAP on how they are planning or doing implementation of NGSS. In addition, state priority number 4 is student achievement. And once the results of the student test scores are considered valid, then they will need to report those in their state accountability plan. Also, state priority number 7 is student access to a broad course of study, and it lists science as one of the examples of a broad course of study. So lastly, professional learning. The California Department of Education has been working their hearts out on this. They have, from the beginning, started working with the K-12 Alliance, the California Science Teachers Association, the County Offices of Education, and CTA, and including the Science Collaborative Committees and the Communities of Practice. For the past 4 years, they've been working with them to present what they call rollouts, which are, they go to a county, they announce it to all the districts in the county, they have all of these people here, and they explain these science standards, how they work, and offer, and Jessica will be able to address this in more detail than I am. But they've been doing this for 4 years, and just last year alone, they had 8 such rollouts, each in a different county. So that pretty much covers state policy and where we are on that.
Well, and then let's naturally segue to Jessica. You've
Thank
been
you, I
set up.
appreciate that. Also, thank you for inviting me to be a part of this panel. I'll build a little bit on what Trish said in terms of the CAST. One of the other shifts that's happening with the statewide assessments that doesn't get sometimes as much attention is the change that's happening at high school. Whereas our prior assessment system had what were known as end-of-course exams, where students participated in an exam at the end of their biology or their chemistry or their physics course. What we have now for high school is a single assessment that covers all of the high school standards. So the assessment will include earth, life, physical, and earth, life, and physical sciences. Excuse me, I was making sure I got all three in that assessment. And that assessment administration is going to be left at the local level in terms of a decision. So it's up to districts to decide when their students are going to be most prepared to take that end of high school assessment. The other thing I wanted to build on is the importance that Trish mentioned about NGSS building concept and knowledge over time. When you're looking at a fifth grade assessment that touches on grades 3 through 5, those build on what happens in K2. And so if you're not presenting and teaching science in K2, you are underserving your kids and underpreparing them for success on the fifth grade assessment. In terms of professional development, our organization has been involved not only in all of the things that Trish outlined, we've been at the table providing input and supporting that entire process. As Trish mentioned, we've also been involved in providing professional learning in the rollouts, which are 2-day events. Series 5 is under development. We are this year offering what we're calling Accelerating into NGSS, which sort of summarizes or takes the best from the first 4 years of content that we've provided and putting it out for those districts that didn't have an opportunity or didn't have the on their radar to participate in years 1 through 4. So we have sort of a makeup class, if you will, in that accelerating into NGSS. We've also been putting together a high school summit in order to help high schools that are grappling with course models, implementation issues, and the like in order to come together and share those experiences and learn from one another. I've also been heavily involved in the California Alliance for the Next Generation Science Standards, which is a loose organization of approximately 60 member organizations that have developed a communications toolkit targeting both teachers and parents in terms of informing them and raising awareness of the next generation science standards, as well as a policy implementation toolkit that provides resources and information for districts who are looking to implement NGSS, planning tools, information about LCAP. The Lawrence Hall of Science has also developed an LCAP toolkit that addresses how to implement NGSS in your LCAP that includes also our state's environmental principles and concepts known as the EP&Cs. In terms of instructional materials, we are greatly anticipating the adoption, and in anticipation of that, CSTA issued a white paper called Priority Features of NGSS Aligned Instructional Materials. We partnered with Nevada, Oregon, and Washington Science Teachers Associations, as all of those are also NGSS adoption states. It gave us an opportunity to network with our neighboring states to put forward a document that we hope informs publishers about what it takes to, in an instructional material, in order to support NGSS. And I will conclude there, other than to say we do have great community, not only in our communities of practice, but also within our membership community, and are always at the ready to support our teachers with questions that they might have.
And I'd also like to start off with saying thank you for including me in this panel. And in my position, kind of at the more local level, I take a lot of what these fabulous ladies are doing and try to get it to my teachers in kind of a manageable amount. And in my district, my elementary teachers are definitely working on implementing the next generation science standards. We are dealing with some mindset shifts still left over from the old standards, both in math and language arts, as well as in science. A lot of our teachers still operate under the mindset of, this is my math time, this is my language arts time, I need this many minutes for this and this many minutes for this. So that only leaves me with a half hour of science every other Friday, kind of a style. And just helping our teachers and our administrators understand that no, the next generation science standards were written in a beautiful way where they actually address a lot of the language arts standards as well as our math standards, and you can integrate things so that you can be teaching math and language arts while you're teaching your science, so it doesn't necessarily take away any of those minutes, it adds to them. Because we don't have instructional materials right now, a wonderful thing happened when we adopted our language arts materials, and they do include some nonfiction science text. So what we've done in my district is we've built some science units that take that science nonfiction text and build hands-on activities and things around that. So we're in the process of developing that. So I would say that my my elementary teachers are implementing the next generation science standards. Are they fully implementing them? No, but they're definitely on the road. They are using the cross-cutting concepts, which is one of those 3 dimensions that were talked about kind of in the report at the beginning. They are using the science and engineering practices, and we're on the road to implementing all of the disciplinary core ideas. I know New, when she was presenting about the report, was talking about how many districts are still undecided at the middle school level. My district took about 1.5 years to decide between the 2 models at the middle school level. And that's not because we weren't thinking about it or it wasn't on our radar. Science teachers are very passionate about science, and they are very firmly in one camp or another. And I will say that my district was very firmly in the discipline-specific camp. We wanted to teach what we had been teaching, and we wanted as little change as possible. And I'll tell you, I'm a biology person, and when I first looked at the standards, I said, you are going to make me talk about rocks? I am not going to be as passionate about rocks as I am about living things. I mean, come on, living things, you can interact with them, you can look inside them, there's cool stuff. I'm not going to be that excited talking about rocks. But we really had to look at the research that went into why the integrated model was the preferred model, and that it really was best for the kids, and take ourselves kind of out of the equation and think, okay, what is going to be best for this class sitting in front of me? And finally, we did decide that we were going to go with the integrated model, and we've made a lot of progress. We've got all of our teachers implementing right now. We have created a scope and sequence for 6th and 7th grade. They still need to be approved by our subject advisory group. And 8th grade is working on their scope and sequence. Our high school teachers have voted to go with the 3-year model, but they've got a lot of unanswered questions. For example, with our 4 comprehensive high schools, we have exactly 4 high school physics teachers. That's not going to work for all students to take physics. So we're going to need to solve that issue. And we've just, got some other questions with that as well. So we're going to have to answer those questions. So right now our teachers are using the cross-cutting concepts and the science and engineering practices in their existing UC-approved biology, chemistry, and physics courses. And we will write a scope and sequence for the 3-course model, but we're not there quite yet. So they are using, 2 of the 3 dimensions and getting most of the disciplinary core ideas in the existing courses, but they're not fully transitioned in those classes either. But one of the wonderful things that they were talking about is the different networking opportunities that there are. And our County Office of Ed in Riverside has done a fabulous job of allowing us to work together, to collaborate. In fact, tomorrow I'm going to a meeting where we're going to address kind of the high school issue, because a lot of the challenges that my district is facing are not challenges only for my district. They're kind of challenges countywide. And so we do work together, we problem solve together, and we share ideas, and that definitely helps. And so I'm so appreciative for that. And, so we are moving forward, and I think that we've got some great things going on, but it's going to continue to get better. And like these ladies talked about, I love the way the NGSS are written, where the science and engineering practices and the cross-cutting concepts build from kindergarten all the way to 12th grade. And the disciplinary core ideas are addressed once K2, once 3-5, once 6-8, and once 9-12. As a classroom teacher, I taught middle school and high school. I had some of the exact same students, and they would swear in high school that they had never learned things before. And I was like, no, I taught you, I was there. So I love that everything is going to spiral But as we're in that transition right now, the students don't have that background, that build up. So I'm trying to help my teachers understand that while we're in this transition, it's almost like we're going to learn how to do NGSS twice, because we're going to teach it right now to the students that don't have the background of having come through it. And then we're going to start to get the students that have that background, and they're going to already know how to ask good questions, and they're going to already know how to come up with their own procedure. Because the first time I tried to do it in my classroom, my students just tried to outweight me. They thought I would eventually hand them a procedure to follow. And so it's going to take some time, and it's a transition. And yes, the state wants us to be fully implementing, but it's going to take some time for everybody to be ready.
Well, actually, I want to kind of pick up on that, of the next milestone that we have coming up, and let me sort of talk about something very specific, is the field test for the assessments. So last year we had the pilot, that was a sample. This is going to be everyone. This is going to be rolled out for all to take a field test. And maybe, Jessica, I'll start with you of asking, sort of, are we ready for that? And I'm going to maybe bound it a little bit for you and say, maybe give me one thing you're worried about and one thing you're optimistic about. How's that?
Okay.
I don't like boundaries.
You don't like boundaries?
Like boundaries? Yeah, I actually, in terms of are we ready for the assessment, in some senses, yes, in the sense that we are ready to have our, if you want to call it our day in the sun, our moment in the spotlight. We're ready for science to get the attention that it deserves. We're frustrated perhaps that the assessment is what's going to bring that forward, and it wasn't the adoption of the standards or the framework or all these other steps that have happened, that it's been the assessment that needs to drive that. We are ready in the sense that we are looking forward to the opportunity for this assessment to be on our state dashboard and in our accountability system, so that again, we're getting the attention that science needs. But in the sense yes, there's the computers that are for the, that part, SBAC has taken care of much of the need for computers and internet and those kinds of things that you need to operationalize. But in terms of our students prepared, I think teachers are doing the best they can to prepare students for what's coming. Just I believe it was this week, the state issued a couple of new practice items for each grade level. So I know we've been pushing that out to our members in order to help prepare their students for the upcoming assessment. But there is a great deal of professional learning and implementation and other structures that need to be put in place before students are fully prepared for these assessments.
Stacy, why don't you?
I'm just kind of echoing a lot of things that you have said. I'm very excited to get some data. I know that this year with the field test, we're going to get some kind of data. We don't know exactly what, but next year we should get actual data. And as a scientist, I like hard numbers. Right now, we've got kind of anecdotal evidence. In our classroom, students are very engaged. I would love to know, are students for sure really learning what they're supposed to be learning? So I'm excited about that. I'm excited that there are 3 different practice tests now, so my teachers are able to prepare a little bit better. Last year they had 1 practice test that had 5th grade, 8th grade, and high school questions on it. So when I was encouraging my teachers to roll that out, 5th grade teachers were like, okay, we're gonna do like these first 6 questions and then stop. So there's a little bit more for them to practice with the different question types and things like that. But just like Jessica said, it's going to take time for teachers to be kind of comfortable with everything that goes into what this test is assessing. There's going to take time for our students to be fully prepared, because they are just getting 1 or 2 years of NGSS education before they're taking this assessment, and it's at least testing 3 years. If you're looking at just the disciplinary core ideas, but if you're thinking about the fact that the science and engineering practices and cross-cutting concepts should have been taught from kindergarten, you're looking at 5 years, 8 years, or 12 years of education that they should have on this assessment.
Tricia, unbounded, are we ready?
Yes, I would say my answer to the question of is the field ready? If this were the NCLB era, and if there were high stakes associated with this test, absolutely not ready. But that's not the case. There will be no high stakes associated with this test. The field test will be a great opportunity for the field to learn, to get some numbers, and I believe I'm correct in saying you'll get percent correct. And have a sense of where you are and where you need to go next. It'll be the first kind of like real look at, okay, wait, either, hey, we did better than we thought we did, or whoops, we've got to look at these areas. And it'll be motivating. It'll be the same for the state. We'll have that test information, and it'll be an opportunity for us to learn and say, okay, what are we nervous about this? Are we feeling pretty good about this? So I think since there's no stakes associated with it, and you'll actually get some data, it'll be good for all of us. The thing about NGSS and California is the biggest state with the most students in the country, and we don't turn on a dime or implement state policy in 2 years. Our decisions are deliberate and careful because we've got 6.2 million kids and 225,000 teachers that get affected by it. And so we're very thoughtful about all the decisions made by the state board and the CDE. And there are too many places that are difficult and a challenge about NGSS, from the pedagogical shifts to the standards format to the new way of testing in grades 5 and 8 to the integrated in 6 to 8 to the high school course models. There are too many things that are different and new that we would not at the state level expect everyone to be implemented at the same level at this point and ready to knock it out of the park on this test. And you don't need to worry about that. We've got your back. At the state board and the CDE understand that this is hard, and we don't care about what we care about is that you keep moving forward and that we provide you with the support that you need to bring good science to all the kids in California. That's what we care about.
So now let's kind of boldly look further into the future. And when I'm talking about future, of course, and sometimes Sacramento terms means the next election, right?
This year it does.
Yeah, this year it does. So we're going to have a new superintendent of education, and we're going to have a new governor, and maybe let's kind of give you guys a definitely unbounded questions in terms of what could you or what might you expect in terms of leadership on the issue of science education, that we could look to those which will be very visible leaders in the state on the broader issue of education. And I'm going to be real mean, Stacy, and put you on the spot to start with that.
That's not fair. If I'm just talking ideals, if I'm being truly ideal, I would love to see science education have an equal place with math and language arts as far as school accountability and priority in funding, in accountability, in all of that. I feel like too often in our schools, science does not get that equal share because, if we're evaluating schools based on, these 5 criteria and science isn't on that list, then science isn't going to get the equal attention. So if that, could be resolved, I think that would be a great thing for science to get a more equal share. I know some science teachers that would not be thrilled with me saying that because they would not want it to be equal in the accountability, but I don't think it'll get, equal funding, time, and attention unless it is.
Trish?
Well, so I'm going to speak more as a private citizen, or a well-informed private citizen. Obviously, I'm not speaking for the whole board when I'm thinking about the future and what I'd like to see. But I agree with what you said, Stacy. In July of 2016, the board did adopt a motion that would include science test results, when valid, in with the LCFF rubric, evaluation rubric. That's a ways off, because we don't even have the field test, and we haven't said that the field test is valid yet, and then there needs to be a couple more years of data before that happens. So I agree with you. I would like to see that brought in with math and English language arts. I also have a couple of kind of wish list things, and maybe that's because I've spent now 7.5 years passionate about science. By the way, the science teachers in California are the most passionate, fun group I've ever known. I've never seen people have so much fun with doing their work. It's been an honor for me to know you guys and to work alongside you for 7.5 years. So some of the things I'd like to see is, I'd like to see the next governor and the next SPI think science is as important as we think it is. That California should see itself as, it's already an NGSS leader in the country. We are an NGSS leader, but our test scores are not showing that we're as committed to science as we need to be. And I'd like, and I would like to see international and national tests in science done again in California. We haven't done that for quite a while. I think that's a good barometer in addition to our own tests to say, how are we doing? I would also like to see the California Department of Education have a state science supervisor, which is like a very high-level person that sends a signal that science is this important to us. Now, I also happen to be the computer science lead for the state board, so I could bundle those two, and it'd be a state science supervisor for computer science and NGSS. I would also like to see California's teachers and administrators getting even more support to fully implement. I would love to see some targeted funding, one-time funding that goes just specifically to NGSS. The thing about the word STEM is it's a concept. It's not a set of standards in California. STEM is a concept of activities that involve science, technology, engineering, math, but we don't have STEM standards. We have next generation science standards, and they're going to be reported out state and to teachers and parents. And we need targeted funding, I think, to give an extra boost and a big boost of energy to the teachers and administrators to get them past this next part where they're more fully implemented. Let's see, anything else? There's a lot I'd like to see. Yeah, a lot I'd like to see.
It's not a bad start.
No, yeah. I'll build on what Trish said. In terms of funding for professional learning, absolutely. And I feel like it needs to be something that's multi-year and sustained rather than 1 year only. There is still a great deal of work to be done. As referenced in the report, equipment and supplies are an issue as it relates to science. Science is a little bit more of an expensive subject than some other subjects, and providing the funding necessary for hands-on phenomena-based science is going to be critical. And we are also, as referenced, coming up to an instructional materials adoption. Our fund's going to be available for that instructional materials adoption to take place. In terms of other priorities, I'd absolutely, CSTA wants to see an increase in the state's graduation requirements from 2 years to 3. We've held that as a policy priority for 20 years or so, if not more. It preceded NGSS and it continues with NGSS, and as other structures that have been put in place, such as the standards as well as the framework, which call for 3 years of science at high school, I think it's only fair that the state also raise its graduation requirements to be consistent in its policy messages. I would also like to, as Stacy said, we really need to support our elementary teachers in implementing science and providing professional learning. And I also believe that there is a little bit of room for improvement in our subject matter requirements for teacher preparation. They have made some revisions to those that are consistent with NGSS, and we believe there's room for improvement in those areas, and so we'd like to see some opportunities for CTC to take the Commission on Teacher Credentialing, to take a closer look at those.
I want to shift gears now and go from the institutions and functioning to the intended recipients of these services and focus on the students. There's a lot of good arguments, a lot of good passionate arguments we can make as to why we would like to have more students interested in science. And we can also make some economic arguments that the state's economy really needs more folks with these skills coming in secondary and post-secondary education. So how is it that we get more students on that pathway? And I'm going to add a degree of difficulty there. How do we get all students, right? How do we try to close some of these gaps that have persisted in California? Maybe we can start closing them around science. Any thoughts along that? And Trish, I'll give you the non-softball question here.
Yeah, these two ladies are probably going to, and by the way, Stacy, I just met this morning for the first time. You are so articulate, and I'm so impressed with how you explained how your school is making these decisions, and the fact that she made note that I think this is International Day for Women, and you have 3 women representing on science, so that's kind of cool too. So back to your question, I agree with the elementary part. One of the things that I became aware of as I was involved with this, with NGSS, was that under the NCLB era, especially low-income kids and EL students in the elementary grades, the teachers, there was so much high-stakes pressure for English language arts and math to raise those test scores that they just squeezed science out. So you have already a generation of low-income kids that had very, very little science in elementary school and that were not prepared for quality science to do well in it in junior high and high school. And I think that I see this as an equity issue on the elementary, all the way through. But on the elementary is where those teachers actually, many of the teachers that are at the elementary level now have never taught science, or it was so minimal that you can't really say that they had taught science. They have a lot of content knowledge, not a lot, but they have to learn some content knowledge, which the ones in junior high and high school already have that content knowledge. So it's a bigger challenge in elementary. And the problem is that if we don't give an extra focus to elementary, then those same students who didn't get science before in elementary, then they go into a middle school and then go into a high school, maybe feed in with other students that have gotten it, and also come from families that do science things at home and on the weekend, and they are at a terrible disadvantage when they do that. So that doesn't solve the whole workforce issue, but it's an important piece that a lot of people think workforce, they think high school to post-secondary and career. But if you want them interested in science and they need to be well informed about science to be an informed citizen. One of the things I love about NGSS is its human impact on the environment aspect. Human impact on the environment. It's why some states decided not to adopt NGSS, because they weren't going to go there. And one of the things that makes me feel like is, okay, this isn't a political statement, okay? But one of the things that makes me feel like, especially, let's just say watching all the storms that are happening and wondering why all these storms are so ferocious and what's going to happen going forward. California, with NGSS, we're going to produce the largest number of adults who understand human impact on the environment. And is that important? I think it's important. And let's start with elementary school, and let's include all kids. Yeah.
And let's start with teaching them to ask why and to continue to ask why. When kids are born and they become toddlers and they start to make observations around the world and then they begin to learn to speak, one of their first questions is why. Not only why did you want me to do that, but also why am I still on the ground? Why don't I float away? These are questions that small kids ask. And then when we get them into elementary school, we need to foster that wonder. We need to foster them to continue to ask why, to seek to understand the world around them. Science isn't just a collection of facts. It's a way of understanding how the world works, a way of asking questions and viewing the world through a scientific lens in order to make sense of the world around you. That starts in elementary school. It's very important in terms of equity for kids to see themselves as scientists when they're little kids, so that when they enter middle school and high school and there are other pressures, they remember what it was like to be a scientist when they were a little kid and maintain that sense of confidence and knowing that it's okay to not know the answer. We can ask why, and when we ask why, let's try and find the answer together. The skills that are needed in order to do that research, to do critical thinking and collaborate with your classmates and peers to try and find that answer to the why is really, I think, the power that NGSS holds in terms of preparing our students and also in terms of equity.
So I'm just going to start by saying I'm speaking as Stacy Lerma, the individual right now.
Just taking the hat off.
So I taught in a district where students didn't have science until 5th grade. And students didn't have science if they were low performing in 6th grade or 7th grade, because the test in 5th grade only included 5th grade standards, and the test in 8th grade only included 8th grade standards. And I was very good at taking a student in 8th grade that had no prior science knowledge and still getting them to be proficient on that old test. And it breaks my heart to think about how many students we did such a disservice to, because students develop that identity in their early years in elementary school. And so because we're a high needs district and we had students that were English learners or students that were special needs and they didn't get science time because they got double language arts and double math in order to perform well on those other tests. And so I really feel like we need to make sure that we are giving time in the elementary schools to support science. We need to make sure that we are supporting our elementary teachers who are amazing. If you've never stopped to think about what an elementary teacher does, they have, 36 small people that are asking them to teach them how to read, write, do math, understand how the government works, understand how science works, teach them PE, help them tie their shoes and blow their nose. And if it rains, they don't even get to go out to lunch or have like a break. So they're doing an amazing amount. And, so when I'm trying to support them, I try to make teaching science as user-friendly as possible for them. But, we need to support them with teaching science so that they're able to get the students when they're kind of forming their opinions of themselves so that they can see themselves as scientists and engineers. I don't know that we've talked about the fact that the NGSS include engineering standards, and how many of our personal children spend time taking stuff apart and putting it back together. They're natural engineers, and it's in the standards now, and they get to do that in the classroom, and that's amazing. And as they hit middle school and high school, pointing out to them that the highest paying jobs that you can have with a bachelor's degree are in engineering. So there's a lot of bang for your buck in that career field. And so helping students to do that, and then giving them role models that look like them, and not just females, but, people of varying ethnicities, trying to recruit science teachers and elementary teachers that, come from different perspectives. My own personal daughter is 10, and she doesn't think that there is a gender gap in science because the only scientist that she knows real well is mommy. And she thinks more girls are scientists than boys. And that's just her very narrow perspective, but, that kind of speaks to what her world is like. And so I think we're going to be able to kind of close some of those gaps by providing those role models, actively recruiting science teachers that come from different backgrounds, and making sure that during those early years when they're dreaming about what they want to be when they grow up, they think of things besides teacher and firefighter and police officer, and they think astronaut, scientist, engineer, and those different things.
Patrick, may I add one more thing about, we've talked a lot about teachers and the changes teachers have to make, but teachers are more likely to make those changes comfortably and feel supported if the administrative leadership and the school board of a district is supporting science and lifting it up in terms of its priority within that district and its priority within that school. So WestEd has recently done a look at, through the Early Implementer Initiative, at the role of district and school leadership, administrative leadership, and school board. I don't know if they included school board members, but I'm including them because they make the final decisions about what's important and how much money is going to be given to various subjects and other kinds of things. And they make the decisions with teacher input, but they make the decisions about what's in the LCAP. And so I want to emphasize how important they are, and that's something else I'd like to see going forward is more school board members and district administrators talking about science as one of their highest priorities.
That local part of
Yes.
LCAP.
Yes.
I'm about a third of the way through the questions I have, but the rest of you came here, I suspect, with an interest in this topic too, so I don't want to be one of those moderators. So I'm happy to open this to questions from you all. And the only thing I'm going to ask is I've got actually two different individuals, both named Kelly, with microphones. And if you could just wait for the mic because otherwise people online can't hear you.
I have a question about adopting the materials and publishers. I worked for a publisher and I sat in on the last materials adoption process. And what I found was that publishers tend to take the bullets you have, clip out the chapters, stick them together, rebind them, and publish them. And what you can come up with is science as a fact-based study instead of a process-based study. And that's one of my concerns. You mentioned Singapore. Singapore has adopted, at least in physics, a non-textbook physics program. When we had Sputnik, how did we get out of the science hole we were in there? We also adopted a non-textbook program, which slowly disintegrated as it became a textbook-oriented program. So my concern is really the adoption of and spending a huge amount of money for garbage, which was done last time.
Was there a question in there?
Are you concerned about this adoption process and this huge amount of politics and money that goes into adopting textbooks, which are basically worthless?
Well, I don't know about the worthless part of it, and I'm not the state board member. Eileen Strauss is the other Next Generation Science Standards liaison for the board, and she's a previous teacher and assistant superintendent. I am a policy person, and so she's going to handle the instructional materials adoption. I do understand that we've had almost 37 different organizations submit materials to be reviewed to see if they're aligned. And they are training the end of April, they're training the reviewers on what to look for. There is, the national organization Achieve has put out a rubric for looking at instructional materials, but in addition, as Jessica mentioned, the California Science Teachers Association took the leadership to get together with the same statewide organizations in Oregon, Washington, and Nevada, to put together a white paper on what they want to see the reviewers looking for in those materials. And so that's going to be shared, I hope, with the reviewers, so they will see that. In addition, I don't think there's a requirement that they be books. I think there could be all kinds of, I don't know what's been submitted, but I think there's no reason why they have to be books. They could also be modules of different kinds. They could be online supplemented kinds of things. I think and kind of hope we've moved away from the idea that everything has to be in a textbook, like a single big textbook. So we've got people looking out for what will it take for it to be NGSS aligned. And then we've got the opportunity now in this kind of new era for more different ways to submit materials and for teachers to use materials.
And while I have been with the organization for 11 years, I was not around when the last adoption took place. That just kind of gives you a little bit of context as about how long it's been since we've had an adoption for science. But I do have institutional memory. It was well ingrained in CSTA's experience with the 1998 adoption. And what I want to highlight is what's different in 2018 than in 1998. The one that Trish pointed out, that it is very intentional that it says instructional materials and not textbook. It is also different in that the state is no longer, fully funding those purchases, but also districts are allowed a great deal of flexibility. There may be districts who choose not to make a formal adoption. There could be districts who do choose to take pieces from one provider and another and put together their own curriculum
And add
resources.
some of their own resources.
And in addition to that, I would say we're also benefiting from the fact that there are 13 other states in this country who have adopted NGSS, and therefore publishers not only have a wider market and make an understanding of what NGSS is. We're not looking for proprietary California materials, maybe a little bit because we have our environmental principles and concepts in our own framework, but the standards are the same and we're sharing them with 13 other states. So I think that opens up the field in terms of what publishers have an opportunity to learn what NGSS looks like and what it takes in an instructional material to support NGSS.
Yeah, I think it's very different from 1998, if that's what you're referencing and thinking about. Very different on many, many levels.
And because I'm concerned about what the materials are going to look like, I applied to be a materials reviewer, and I'm actually going to go get trained in April. So I'm going to be on that panel, and hopefully we'll see really good
Message received.
really awesome materials.
I've got a question over here.
Yeah, hi. So you all spoke to how in the past science had been squeezed out of the classrooms because of this strong pressure to focus on math. And
Especially elementary.
Exactly. So I'm a scientist, and I have spent the majority of my career doing my PhD and my career in research regretting the fact that I didn't take more high-level math as an undergrad. So to what extent, as you're developing these new standards and integrating all of these different sciences, actually folding in math into the curriculum as well?
Well, one of the, there's two areas I want to talk about in terms of that. One of the state level activities that's taking place are known under the Standards Implementation Steering Committee, which is a collaboration of State Board and CDE and the CSESA, which is the County Offices of Education group. There are two projects within that, one for science, one for math. And we have met, I believe, 3 times as collaboratively, both science and math community of practices, getting together to learn professionally about how these standards can work together, how they support one another, how they can be integrated. And I know that there's work going on within some sub-projects of that are very intentionally integrating science with math. The other that I wanted to address is that the standards themselves within their very structure have connections to the Common Core math standards that are relevant to those performance expectations within the NGSS. And so being able to explicitly point out those connections to teachers who are preparing their units of study and their curricular resources, they have that explicitly stated there. So it facilitates the integration.
Did you want
More question?
No,
Okay.
I got nothing.
Oh, just to speak to that, when putting together a performance task for a NGSS lesson, almost always it necessitates the use of math. The very annoying thing that I used to say to my students was that math is the language of science. It doesn't really serve a purpose unless you're applying it to science.
Well, that's a little radical.
Of all the things that have been said, now that's going to generate the moment.
I
Sorry.
think architects think it's important too, engineers.
I would argue that those are applied sciences, but sorry. But when we're building our units in my district, we are very conscious about showing those links to mathematics and language arts as well, just because being able to show how you're supporting the other subject areas is something that administrators often want us to do anyhow, and so being able to kind of show some of those connections to a lot of that higher level math. So I think within your physics class, your chemistry class, you might have seen more of that if you were coming up through the NGSS era.
So on the subject of integrating science into the elementary levels, it sounds like there are a couple ways you could do it. You could get that subject material, that subject expertise to the elementary teachers so that they're integrating it into their classrooms. Or you can have people who are dedicated science teachers where they're doing pullouts, where students are coming out of their classroom a couple times a week to go to science. And so I was curious if there are any thoughts about whether one of those options seems to work better or if they both have advantages.
I would really want to leave that to be a local decision that is based on, I mean, what does the school look like? Do they have the space for that standalone science where kids I mean, there are so many decisions I think that go, or so many factors that go into making that decision that it would be difficult to say one model is better than another. And I'm not aware of any research right now in terms of what makes the most sense. I do want to add, though, that in addition to integrating with math, you can also integrate very nicely with literacy. The state of California did some work aligning our science standards with our English language development standards. Educators who are implementing in the classroom and working with English learners have found that not only is student engagement shooting through the roof because kids just really like learning this way, but they're also, these kids who may not have a facility for language in English are finding a way to communicate, whether they're drawing a model in order to explain their thinking, even if they can't necessarily put their words to it. They're able to develop that language through their I don't want to use academic discourse because that sounds like a very official word, but through dialoguing with their fellow students and developing their language little by little through that dialogue. I think it's very powerful.
Yeah, speaking for just personal preference, because the next generation science standards, one of the big ideas in them is the ability to apply science in a variety of settings. I don't love the pullout model just because, then it's science time and I'm putting on my science hat and it's not necessarily being able to recognize phenomena in all settings. And so that's my concern with pullout. Obviously, having science experts is a benefit, but also being able to integrate it with everything. The LPAC, which is the new test for English language learners showing their proficiency, actually has a section on it where students have to use some science skills. And so I think the more that students kind of integrate the different subject areas, especially at the elementary level, the more it's going to benefit them in a variety of areas.
On the other hand, I think it doesn't have to be an either or. You could have the teachers that are teaching English and teach math bring science in with that work as it's aligned, and still have a pullout where that teacher is particularly in-depth knowledgeable about NGSS and maybe does all the experiments and the investigations and that kind of thing. And so it's that one's NGSS intensive, and the other teachers are pulling NGSS into the ELA and math and ELD.
And I would have to guess there's almost a resource issue here too, because as you mentioned, I mean, we aren't oversupplied with science teachers. So the issue of number of physics teachers you have or whatever, how you're going to allocate those resources is going to have to come into play too. So, another question?
Thank you. I am interested in knowing if you've considered at all trying to emphasize on the implementation a rollout by grade level. I'm thinking of a niece of ours who was exposed to the new math in about 6th grade, and the struggle she had and the negativity that her parents brought to it because of that change. And I thought if you roll out where you emphasize kindergarten first and then each grade level is getting, so these children have had it from the beginning with the understanding to the upper grades that we understand, and the parents, we understand you don't have that background. If you're addressing that, because it seems like it's such a shock to them. And then I have a second question. Are you addressing, or are the colleges addressing how the elementary science program works? Are they getting, elementary teachers getting the newest NGSS type science training in the college?
So thank you for asking one of the questions on my list. So 2 questions. One is in some ways preparation, and then the other is sort of rollout by grade. I don't know if
I'll take the rollout by grade.
Great.
No, we do a standards adoption about every 18 years, where we relook at everything and decide whether it needs to be changed. And this was a very big change for science, you're right, but it didn't change what we know about physics or chemistry or biology. It didn't change any of that. It just changed the way it gets taught. And if you did a rollout by grade, by the time you finished 18 years later, we would be doing a new standards adoption.
I was thinking elementary.
Oh, you were thinking grade span. And actually, the state doesn't do it that way, but districts can choose to do it that way. They could choose to say, we're going to go with elementary, put all of our emphasis on elementary now, although they have trouble doing that since there's a test at 5th grade, test at 8th grade, and one test in high school. So, but they can still kind of choose where they put their emphasis and where they think their teachers are going to have the most struggle, and that's where they put their emphasis with professional learning and resources.
Well, I know the science content has changed. I was looking at training and background and preparing the public.
Yeah, I think that math was a special circumstance that a lot of people felt that way about.
Speaking to that, we kind of did that in my district a little bit, not at the elementary or at the high school, but because middle school went from discipline specific under the old CST to integrated, we had to pay attention to where things had been taught and making sure that students still got all of the science content. And so we kind of had a gradual, we were calling it implementing the next generation science standards, but as far as being fully integrated, that did take us a few years. So 6th grade was fully implementing, whereas 7th grade was doing some of the integration, but teaching some of the things that were still life science that the sixth graders had not been taught the prior year. And so we did try to account for that to make sure that students wouldn't have gaps in their science content knowledge. So we were aware of that, and we did make sure that we let parents know. We also tried to get in front of, and I know a lot of the publications that were put out in order to share with families, we tried to get in front of the idea and let parents know that the reason that we switched to these standards and the reason the state had adopted them was to help students to be more successful in science and based on data. And, you know, if you're looking at science as just a whole list of facts, which is unfortunately the way that the old standards were interpreted, versus being able to actually hands-on do things with science, the new science standards were going to be a lot more beneficial for their children. So we didn't get a ton of pushback or people feeling really negative about these standards. Most of the parents that I have encountered really love this. They think their students are enjoying it. They like that there's the engineering. That's been really popular with parents, and so it's actually gotten a really positive reception. And as far as not making the transition more slowly in elementary, we really felt like there's going to be kind of a gradual, just in the amount of science being taught, increasing over the years. And so we didn't really want to push it, you know, K1, 2 over 3 years and 4, 5, 6, just because the teachers transitioning themselves was going to kind of take some time. And so that wasn't a decision that we chose to make at our district.
And I like how Stacy framed her comments in that she talked very much about what happened in her district in Moreno Valley. It is a local decision as to how to implement and roll out these standards. And I know our organization has published on our website a couple of options for middle school and making those transitions for those who are going from domain to integrated. But I think it's also addressed in the implementation planning tools. It's a part of the planning process that needs to involve teachers and other stakeholders in order to make those determinations about what's best for the teachers in the school and the students and how to prepare them.
And I would just add one more comment to that, since you brought up Common Core math. And I'm not the math person, but one of the differences that I think, what makes them different, I think, in terms of parent reaction, is that with math, the new Common Core math, often students came home with an assignment that the parents didn't have a clue how to help with. Suddenly, they didn't know how to do whatever, you know, it's like the new math. They didn't know how to do to help and be supportive, and didn't even understand, many parents, exactly what were those changes and why were they changed. And so there was some tension around that because of that. With Next Generation Science Standards, kids aren't coming home and saying, I need you to conduct an experiment with me, and this is how we do it. Now with NGSS, we're doing cross-cutting concepts, so that's not happening. They're coming home excited about what they've done in science class that day, and so it gets a much more favorable parent review and student review. It's the subject is something is embraced. The standards are being embraced in science in a way that was a little bit more of a challenge with math.
Does anyone want to try to quickly address the preparation thing? Is it happening? Maybe is yes, no,
Teacher
maybe.
prep, I don't know.
I think the question was more around whether or not universities have shifted their approach to teaching science to be consistent with NGSS.
Science courses that I was addressing the science courses that elementary, I should say prospective elementary teachers need to take as part of their college training.
Right. I believe you might find some of the answers you're looking for in the subject matter requirements that were produced by the Commission on Teacher Credentialing around teacher preparation in that subject. Yeah, I don't have a great deal of knowledge on that one.
Yeah, me either.
I actually have the unfortunate challenge to bring this to an end. But what I will say is we've got 3 panelists I think will stick around. I've got Sarah and Luna and New, who are the authors on the report, who will stick around. I don't know if Sarah can, but I know New and Laura can. And I have just a couple of housekeeping things. One is that you will receive an evaluation at PPIC. If you don't know, we love data. And so if you could give us your feedback on these events, that's really helpful for us. Second, coming event plug, I can't resist. A week from tomorrow, March 16th, Eric McGee will be here in this room talking about the California Redistricting Commission, a report that just came out. Yes. That's rather timely in all these conversations about gerrymandering. I want to thank the folks who make all of this happen magically. Kelly and Marla and Alexia are back there, and there's more that do that, but it just happens seamlessly and amazingly, which I'm always awed by. And then last, I think you'll join me in thanking our panelists who have brought themselves, their knowledge, and their passion for this really important topic, one of the more fun panels I've had the pleasure to moderate. So thanks.